I wanted to open with a little personal story. I haven't had a chance to tell this before in such a large audience, but I have an autoimmune condition called psoriasis, which is pretty common, and it's easy to manage with various kinds of immunosuppressant drugs and topical steroids and other things that have long-term side effects. And I had a lot of other symptoms that come along with that condition, fatigue, difficulty sleeping, weird pains. And I remember the last time I went and talked to my primary care physician about this. And we had our meeting, went through everything, and I went through this whole list of symptoms and this complex phenomenology, and he said, yeah, sounds like you know a lot more about this than I do. And I really have no idea how to help you. In fact, we, the profession, have no idea how to help you with problems like this. Come back in 2 years, you're healthy as a horse. I said, but I'm miserable. So as a scientist at MIT working with rare disease populations, I hadn't really thought about taking my academic experience and applying it to my own life, despite years of kind of non-written self-tracking. And the talks over the last few hours have really gotten into why do we self-track? We want to observe, we're curious, we want to learn something about ourselves. And we want to take that learning and change the decisions we make in our life, to change our diet, to remove things from our diet, to engage with our friends. And then we debate. And as a psoriasis patient, there's some wonderful online forums you can go to. And I've discovered some variability in my symptoms related to diet. And it's fascinating because you go in and you see the same discussion over and over again. Diet cured my psoriasis. And this other person says, I tried it and it didn't work for me, it's not true. There's no scientific evidence, and the debate continues. And that same discussion happens every month. A new forum, new discussion, new debate, oftentimes the same actors. And it started me thinking, how do we bring more rational discourse to this sort of debate? It's like, I tried it and it worked, here's the data. And I tried it and it worked, and it didn't work, and here's the data for that. So then it raises the question of, well, who does it work for and who doesn't it work for? That community thinks about 15% of people respond, but nobody anywhere in the world knows why or who. So I want to think about, this is sort of a science geek talk a bit. So for the medical professionals, I'm going to try not to be too detailed, but I want to get into a little bit to methodology. How do we know, how do we have confidence in this learning that we're extracting, particularly if you don't have a health coach available or a wonderful doctor like Paul to work with? And I started thinking about what can I learn from your experience that's going to minimize the time I waste in treatments that won't help. And we can learn what to measure to find out whether diet's going to impact my condition. How do I measure it? How often do I measure it? What instruments do I use? How long do I track? How do I interpret all that information? It's actually quite difficult. I go to the Quantified Self Conference. Almost everybody you talk to is like, yeah, I don't really self-track. It's too hard. And I say, well, how long do you test this little pill that you take to increase your mental function? Yeah, I don't really know. And so I think there's an opportunity when we think about self-tracking in groups to aggregate information, not just on outcomes, but on process, on methodology. So the approach that I've taken to how can I learn from you and your experience is what's the minimum amount of standardization that allows me to extrapolate a little bit from your experience. So for example, if you tried a diet and you measured it in a particular way and it worked, can I just pick up that process and run it for myself at really low cost? And in the background. And so we can agree on how we're going to measure. We can agree on what the protocol is. I'll have an example in a little bit of a patient on a forum who came up and said, I'm going to measure in the following way. I'm going to report back to this community. Here's the protocol that I do. Then we get to involve peer review. I can look at your data and help you interpret. Was there something that you didn't measure that might have influenced the data? Maybe you got the wrong answer in that it is helping you, but you didn't see it because you weren't sleeping enough. Or maybe it did help you, but we didn't see it because we didn't measure long enough. And these are the kinds of things that are very difficult where coaches can help. So we need some tools to facilitate that collaborative engagement. And then I think the point was made in the last session that in Facebook, you're being tracked all the time. Our lives are tracked by our financial advisors. They're tracked by insurance companies. We are so quantified, you can't even imagine. I used to be in this business, so I can attest to this, that I can predict what you're going to buy, what you're going to click, in aggregate, pretty well, from surprisingly little data. And yet, none of that is used in medical practice today. It's sort of shocking. So I created a little site to experiment with some of these ideas, create a marketplace for treatments, instruments, ways of measuring, and experimental protocols. and this is called personalexperiments.org, and I'm currently doing research projects with this, but I hope to open it up to the world over the coming weeks and months. And simply, you have a search box, as Susanna talked about this morning, you can go to and start looking at, well, what have people already said? What kind of treatments are available that people have documented? And you can create your own treatments, throw them in here, and work with them yourself. And it has some tools in it very similar to the tools that Anne Wright was talking about earlier today, and hers are much prettier than mine. But simply, we're trying to collect enough self-tracking information on just the measures that are relevant to answering a question. And once you're done answering that question, if you go away and don't ever track again, I can still learn something from your particular experience. And I think that's very different than many sites out there today where you want to look at large observational data sets over long periods of time. I can't self-track for more than a few days, except when I started sending myself SMSs from the site, and I collected fatigue data over a much longer time period than I ever had before. And Michael, in the next talk, will talk to you a little bit about what happens when we take this model and we translate it into the clinic. So earlier today, we were talking about statistical process control. So looking at the behavior of a system, collecting baseline data, and then saying, what's going on in that data? We look for special causes that explain the variation that we observe. And the formal decision rules of statistical process control were developed almost empirically to try to balance the cost of being wrong. If I change my factory because I had the wrong data, it's very expensive. And the cost of missing something that can help me improve my process. But in the individual, I want you to think it's very different when we're working in the context of an individual. So this data shows you two observations, neither of which were statistically significant, but both of which were valid phenomenology. One is that first circle was right after I went out to a wine tasting. I know I cannot drink alcohol, but once I start, I can't stop. So I had 6 glasses of wine at the wine tasting. It was very good. We bought a case. And the next 3 days, sure enough, I have a hypothesis that wine will cause a dramatic increase in fatigue. And I was really excited because all of a sudden, even though I've seen this for years in my head, I saw it on paper. And that was profound. Now, the next circle you can see is a confounding factor. Until I started measuring my sleep with my zeometer, I had no idea how badly I shafted my sleep. So, and interestingly, just wearing the Zeo, my average sleep goes up a lot. It's hard to tell because I can't measure my sleep when I don't have my Zeo, but my wife can attest to my much lower level of sleep. So when we move from trying to understand these special causes and the variation, the more our baseline becomes stable, the easier it is to start doing experiments that look at subtler effects. And so single subject experimentation is a way to start being a bit more formal about our learning. A lot of the examples we saw today were what I'd call A-B experiments. I felt bad, I tried something, I felt better, oh, it must work. Now, it's possible that you felt better for some other reason. And so in science, we always worry about the unmeasured confounder, the alternative explanation, which means I'm wrong about my conclusions. Single subject experimentation works for a class of problems with relatively stable baselines because what you want to do is go from A-B to A-B-A. When you go back to A and you take the treatment away, then your symptoms return. You know that that is a good ongoing treatment. This doesn't work as well with curative conditions because once you're cured, you have no way of knowing whether the treatment was the cure or something else was the cure. On the other hand, who cares? Because this is personal. So formally is a multiple crossover design, patient is control. Long, long tradition in psychology, not so much in medicine, but something that's growing, as you'll see in a little bit. So these are trials, but these are not clinical trials. What I'm trying to learn is how do I change my life for the better? And right now I do it by guessing. I read on the forum, maybe diet will help. I try diet, I try it badly, it doesn't work, or it does work, and I continue on in my life. But we can also say, maybe there was a confounder or a placebo response, and I just don't even care. Because if it worked and my life is manifestly better, even if it's not a biological mechanism of action, it's a psychological mechanism of action, that's fine. But as for me to learn from you, maybe I'm not a good placebo responder, so your treatment won't work for me. What I want to do is over time, go back and say, maybe we were wrong in our first result, but 6 months later, are you still doing this treatment? And are you still seeing that same outcome data? So even if you come to my site, you do an experiment, you go away for 6 months, I can still reach out to you and say, hey, are you still doing the treatment? Are you willing to give me a few weeks of data to show that you're still doing better overall? So I call this future sampling. We have an opportunity to go out into the future and see whether or not the short-term data reflects over the long term. And this is not something you get to see very often in actual clinical trials. So because this is a lifelong process, we can think differently about the statistics. And so to kind of sum up the individual learning process, we learn about variability, we try to identify and remove special causes, and then we can engage in formal experimentation to figure out what treatment gives us the best response. And what I'm really interested in then is if we start to structure our experience like this, we get evidence that allows us to start making recommendations. So if I go to this forum and I see 40 different interventions, and I designed my experiments, I figured it would take me 7 to 10 years to try them all. So that's 7 to 10 years of doing the wrong thing until potentially I find something that works. So can we speed up that cycle by removing things that are unlikely to work and by moving things up that are more likely to work? The epidemiologists will tell you you can't generalize from N of 1 experiments. I've had wonderful debates around this. I said, but if this works for everybody with my condition, you can't tell me I shouldn't take that information into account in deciding how to order my experimental exploration. And the Bayesians will tell you, yeah, you can, but it depends. I don't really care so much about that because, again, I'm just trying to bias my odds because today all I'm doing is guessing with really bad data. So what kinds of things can we learn at the group level? Going back, we can learn about the effect size. If this is a treatment that has a very small effect, this can take me a lot longer to find out if that effect is real. And maybe the intervention is really onerous. So quite frankly, it's not a good thing to try. What I'd like to go is for the things that have very large effects because I don't need to get as much data to peer through all the potential confounders, other things that might explain my improvement, to know that this is working. So if I don't see that large effect, it's probably not working for me. So to sum up, moving from self-tracking to self-experimentation is really about thinking about the minimal methodology that we can bring to our experience and the documentation we need to bring to our experience so that other people can pick it up and use it. And that's what personal experiments is all about. And Michael's going to tell you a little bit about what happens when we do this in the context of the clinic. Thank you.